conditions. But what is clear is that humanity as a whole tolerates anti-Black racism to its own peril, because anti-Blackness is ultimately anti-human. So that conversation with Nelson around the theory of inhumanity and humanization from Fanon's point of view, you can begin to understand how this cosmology, the colonial cosmology, is genocidal. So we can begin to identify the characteristics of colonial cosmology. It's genocidal, and it starts with the inability to see the other as equally human, and by extension, equally deserving. How else then do we explain the fact that those who take keep what they've taken? No reparation. And not just in South Africa, there's reconciliation without you know the word, right? What would make reconciliation make sense if there's been dispossession? Reparations. No reparation. Sometimes no apology either. There's also this inability to coexist in this cosmology, the colonial cosmology. Inability to coexist. So it's the right to exist at the expense of all else. And the other side to colonial cosmology is imperialism, right? It is imperialist by nature, and what follows is extractivism. And again, in the reading that you have, there are many forms of extractivism, epistemic, but in material ways, the taking without giving much back. How resources, natural resources, are taken and turned into commodities that enrich the elite. Colonial cosmology also explains fascism. But at an individual level, the one thing that we often see is hubris. And we often step back and we ask ourselves, where is this audacity to, where is it coming from? Taking up space, not given, and to the point that this a term that emerges, caucasity, that Nelson spoke about. So it helps to really name the character of colonial cosmology. I also have some clarifications around the one slide yesterday. Is that clear enough? Okay, it is clear enough. We don't need to switch off. it's clear enough. So when you see the picture at the bottom and you see the state, right? Of course, you see the current state doing what you're seeing there. So it's a black-led government in South Africa currently. And you can see that the state is represented by black bodies on the name. But there's a hidden hand. The hand that is unseen in that picture, which results in premature death. And this is where it becomes very important to connect this picture with the spiderweb metaphor to explain the hidden hand. So in that case, where miners go on unprotected strike, which is protracted and ends in a massacre, there's a multinational. Remember when I was talking about who resides, the institutions that reside at the center. And many, even in South Africa, forget that hidden hand. So the mining company, where this massacre trying to go to, yeah. It's called Lonmin. Are you picking up what Lonmin stands for? So not from South Africa. Lonmin. What may Lonmin stand for? What's shorthand? What is it shorthand to? London Mine. So at the time of the massacre, some of us Googled Lonmin, and we found people that you can see with names and nationality. And the directors, all of them, the executive directors to Lonmin were individuals with dual citizenship. British citizenship, some not even South African. Someone whose voice gets used to deal with these protesters, who sends an email during the events before the massacre and says that the protest requires concomitant action. That person, an executive director of Lonmin, is a black man who is our current president. Yes, so Ramaphosa. So he becomes the one who instructs what must happen before he joins the cabinet while he was still a businessman. So when you talk about local elites collaborating with multinationals, you can see that, right? It was very useful to hear Ruthie speak about structural adjustments, because we certainly see the devastating effects of that as a settler colonial state, so indebted through the World Bank. So again, at the center, you have these entities that tell states that should otherwise be sovereign and be able to make their own decision what to do. So you will borrow this money because you need it, but you will use that money for this, that, and the other. And at the same time, there is a demand for austerity measures. Fiscal discipline is a requirement when you have these loans. So, infrastructure development, not allowed. And what we see often in South Africa is that those who work for state-owned enterprises, who try and work for the people, do the things that the state-owned entities are meant to do, are slapped with allegations of corruption. And you might have heard about state capture and how during the presidency of Zuma, state capture involving Zuma and his Indian friends, the attempt was to loot from the state. And others are implicated. And in the end, when Zuma is pushed out, and Cyril Ramaphosa, who it's clear whom he works for, becomes president, there's a commission of inquiry where these individuals who are fingered for corruption will participate in a process where we get to hear the truth about what happened under the Zuma presidency. And everyone at that point, almost everyone is convinced that these individuals are indeed corrupt. So one state-owned entity is Eskom, which generates electricity for the nation. But at the time that there's this push for Zuma to be pushed out, and there's this narrative of state capture, South Africa is contemplating a mixed energy basket to keep the lights on for the country. And the energy mix obviously includes nuclear. And there's a big hoo-ha. The media goes berserk, getting all of us riled up against nuclear. And the contract that South Africa and Russia were to sign is framed as an attempt to bankrupt us. At this point, Eskom is able to keep the lights on somewhat. And after Zuma goes, and those individuals who are corrupt, so-called corrupt, are taken out, and at some point we have a white man who takes over Eskom, the blackouts start. Yet the media doesn't talk about these blackouts and why they're happening now. Until today, those individuals whom we thought were corrupt are not being, well, there's a parade when they get arrested, but there's no evidence of the corruption. One of these individuals who takes the state on, the state on behalf of others, persists on clearing his name. And I think the allegation against this individual is that he accepted bribes from a multinational and signed a contract because he had taken the money. And at the time of his arrest, we are told that this is a winnable case. How many years later, since 2017, there's no evidence that they can produce. None. When this individual ultimately reaches one of the high courts, the final court finding is that he cannot insist on the courts persisting with this case, which he wanted, because what this other multinational did has nothing to do with him. And by this time, this person had lost their job. Their bank accounts were frozen. Even their wife could not do business. So no justice, no evidence, and with a track record of having kept the lights on. Just think about what it does to an individual. Those who know him, who talk to this individual, will tell you that suicide was a possibility. So people being pushed to suicide for various reasons, but in this case, for an individual who wanted for South Africa what we are seeing in Spain. And this is just one example. There's another, a number of individuals actually linked to another state-owned entity which deals with ports and transportation. And in one piece of allegation is that what was ordered in terms of the kinds of locomotives that you find in Spain, that they ordered wrong carriages for the infrastructure that we have. Just think about that. Just think about that. And later on, once this person is removed, we see the locomotives, and there's nothing wrong. Yes. But there's a lot going on through the World Bank and the IMF that leads to the South African state being pushed into state failure. So along with austerity measures, there's been currency manipulation. Let's take a guess. What do you think the rand-dollar exchange was during apartheid? Less than 10 rand to a dollar, yeah?
In the range.
So this is until 1994 and going back to 1960s, the range is from 1.3 and 3 rand. So one dollar costs 1.3 or 3. To now, what is the rand dollar exchange?
17 rand 63 cents.
Imagine that. So during apartheid, our currency is strong. After apartheid, it begins on a free fall. So the question to ask, what democracy are we talking about? Isn't it curious that the dollar thrives on an apartheid state or under an apartheid state? Gaza, South Africa, long history. This goes on, and this prohibition of proper infrastructure development to sustain a people, while the IMF and the World Bank demands that we should stay open for foreign investment. And these multinationals are insured through taxpayers' money in case something goes wrong. South Africa will have to pay these multinationals. So you can understand how, what you see in former French colonies, where money and currency is still in the behest of France. It plays out in ways that are not so different in other parts of the world. Inflation targeting is also part of those structural adjustments. I mean, think about it. Why can't we print money too? Because that's what the States does whenever they're in debt, they just print money. But we're not allowed to do so. And one may even ask, and maybe you had this question since Monday, about genocide where white people are not involved. What about Rwanda? Wasn't that genocide? Yes, exactly. I'm glad you know. Do you want to unpack, Desiree? How they were involved?
That the UN basically created, Belgium created the conditions, UN facilitated the slaughter, and then they left.
Yes. Yes. There's a book worth reading. Again, a novel by a young person, focused on a school for the elite in Rwanda, and you get a very interesting perspective on what happened there. Our Lady of the... So the title of the book is Our Lady of the Nile. And the author is Scholas. I have to look it up because it's an unusual name, Mukasonga. and you'll find out how this colonial cosmology also plays out in what, white people, including the church, were doing in Rwanda at that time. And I mean, in terms of the interference of colonial powers in what happens in Rwanda, some of it is linked to naming and changing names of whole people. So before the interference, you were only a Rwandan. If you were a citizen of Rwanda, you would be a Rwandan national. But they introduced this division between the people by calling others Hutus and the other Tutsis. Those terminologies were there, but had nothing to do with how you look. They were there in relation to how much cattle you have. So if you had cattle, so it was a class identity, and the Belgians changed it to something else. So I spoke about how South Africans of my complexion are also given names, not allowed to give ourselves names. But we also denied indigeneity to Africa, or at least that part of Africa. Imagine that. We are told we came from elsewhere. Elsewhere in Africa, without borders, people circulated on the continent. There were waves of movements. But at the same time, if you've encountered many people from the continent, you'll see that our phenotype is very interesting. Because in terms of genetic makeup, we're the most diverse in terms of what the human genome allows. And it's linked to that blueprint and the origin of humankind. As people migrated from Africa, it's the cradle of humanity, there were mutations. And those who settled elsewhere did a lot of exchange of genes, but within limited parameters. The diversity in Africa explains how the blueprint for humanity. An interesting thought that we can be told otherwise, that we come from elsewhere, we don't belong there. In the article you have, I write about co-option at the national level, right? Different levels of co-option. And I use the example of the adoption of non-racialism as color blindness. And it becomes, again, an opportunity for settler colonialists to hide the continuation of dispossession. The material conditions are linked to racialized identities, but you don't want that addressed. You want us to pretend that we are one. And I keep thinking about this data that is no longer being collected in places like Aotearoa, New Zealand, and what that is about. When we left, some of us yesterday, we were having a discussion that I wish I could have been able to stay until the end, but we had a dinner arrangement, and we had people already waiting for us. And the question that I stayed thinking about was around spirituality. And we started with a conversation about energy, and then I remember Abraham's intervention. And I thought it might be useful to talk about spirituality versus religion. Because when you conflate the two, there's something that is obscured. Spirituality, in the way that I understand it, is about connectedness. We spoke about connectedness earlier, and it's connectedness at different levels. Connectedness to self, to others, to the environment, whatever the environment is for you, fauna and flora, the land, everything, the cosmos. But it's also connectedness to a higher being, if you choose to have your spirituality include that aspect. So for me, I do, because I recognize that I didn't create myself. So I speak about the Creator, and in saying so, I link this to how my people knew of a presence of a higher being with a name, Nwari. But with Christianity, again, we find settler colonialists changing the name of whom we regard as the Creator, what you were talking about in terms, using Ireland as an example. And what happens for people who speak my language and many others is that the name in the Bible for the Creator has a prefix, mu, mudzimu, mujimu. Mu is a prefix for a person. So there's a reduction of this higher being to an entity that becomes like a human, and you can even give them a gender. Again, this audacity to name even that which you do not have a right to name on behalf of others. And I was thinking about what Ruthie said about, was it Ruthie? No, it was Linda on Lugonis backward-looking anger, right? And I was thinking of that in relation to how I find spirituality useful. In that, in connectedness to the self, that's where I am able to manage emotions such as anger. And my husband will tell you that I hardly ever express anger. It doesn't mean that I don't get distressed and angry, but it's in how I manage it, in the space I find myself. And mediating anger in the way that I do, through connectedness to self, has served me well. But it also is the case that when there's a sense that there's something higher than me, I find it brings that thing which you need to counter hubris, is humility. You may not find that in some religions or some expressions of religion, humility. But also you may find that religion that is disconnected from spirituality, because I can see how some religious formations are there to serve as a place to curate practices and traditions and rituals that sustain spirituality. I'm not familiar with many religions. Actually, the one religion I'm very familiar with is Christianity. But that's where I got harmed. So bodies like mine, bodies like members of the LGBTQIA, we often find churches extremely violent. So yeah, I just thought it might be useful to separate spirituality from religion. They are not the same. Religion may work for some people, but not everyone. Today, and I'm inspired. I was inspired by what happened earlier today. It was a heavy session, and thank you for the groups that shared. That you shared and gave us a gift. Poem, poetry, singing, and I keep thinking about how song has been a very useful medium for many collectives going through struggle. And I was reminded that today is the day when Solomon Mahlangu was born. This is someone who dies at age 21. He dies in 1977 by hanging. What was his crime? His crime is what is called common intent. So we talk about coloniality and individualism, where we are individuals, not collectives, and we cannot form solidarities based on identities and names that we give ourselves. But when it suits the colonizers, you are a collective. Common intent for Solomon Mahlangu arises this way. So this is after 1976, the youth uprisings, and the following year, there is a plan to commemorate 1976. And Solomon and others had been in Eswatini. It's called Swaziland. It's now called Eswatini. People who are exiled, but also while in exile, they go through training, including combat training. So they come back, the three of them, with suitcases that have false bottoms, because that's how you hide stuff, right? Pamphlets, but also ammunition. And they were being tracked as they entered South Africa from Eswatini, and at some point they are stopped. They panic, they drop the suitcase, and something falls out of the bag. It's an AK-47. So they scatter with Solomon Mahlangu running blindly into a police station, or he finds himself close to a police station. So it's easier to deal with him, right? So they shoot him in the leg. One of the three escapes, but another one, Mutaung, somehow gets his hands on a gun, and at a place where they were, there was a warehouse, and he shoots in a panic, and 2 white people die. Rupert Kesner and Kenneth Wolfendale. You've killed a white person? Is that allowed? Can you survive killing a white person? I mean, their lives matter than everyone else, right? And that shows up in the punishment. Remember, he didn't pull the trigger. He got shot. And because Mutaung gets beaten up to a pulp, focused on his head, he becomes brain injured and declared unfit to sit trial. But the law at the time is that you have to sentence someone for murder. So Solomon becomes that person that has to stand trial. He loses his defense bid, and the sentence is death by hanging. This is what he says before he goes down in the gallows. Tell my people that I love them. They must continue the fight. My blood will nourish the tree that will bear the fruits of freedom. You tell me, who says something like that? If there isn't an alternative cosmology to the one we were talking about earlier. Unsurprisingly, this man has inspired a struggle song. Sorry, I'll start it from the beginning and then I'll stop it halfway because it repeats. But it's about Solomon. This is... Okay. So you can feel the energy when this kinds of songs are sung and how that energy carries people to keep on fighting. And it's just saying Solomon Mahlangu was killed by the Boers, and the Boers being the Afrikaners. But yet, it's the Afrikaners who are facing genocide. I mean, you saw the visuals. Of course, it's a documentary. There's a depiction of what happened there. So we can, Abraham? Yeah, you can do it? Okay, thank you. So we're continuing with outlining genocide at the point of colonial encounter from the perspective, from a geopolitical, historicized, global health perspective. And I want to start with a global institution. And I'm not sure sometimes where to place them in relation to the spider web metaphor. The World Health Organization. I see smiles. And Ruthie spoke about Davos. And a lot has happened at Davos because Davos, the World Economic Forum, proclaims that they bring those with money, government, and all other important leaders, not us. And they meet frequently. And the WHO is an entity that in 1986 did something progressive. Those of us who are in health sciences perhaps can also add here, especially from Canada. You know what I'm talking about? The Ottawa Charter, declared in 1986, and it's the Ottawa Charter for Health Promotion, which is adopted at the first International Conference on Health Promotion. How does it come about? This declaration, which is a document outlining strategies and actions for improving global health. Strategies and actions for improving global health. Why was this need to change tech? What were researchers seeing all over the world? The evidence was pointing to the fact that it's only a fraction of what we do in healthcare that explains positive health outcomes. The rest is something else. So health promotion is then understood as a process of enabling people to improve or increase their control over and improve their health. So control over our health and to improve our health. So enabling that is what they realize is what needs to be done. They figured out that prerequisites for health are peace, shelter, education, food, income, a stable ecosystem, sustainable resources, social justice, and equity. Could you see why I said it was a progressive shift? Really, it was a moment to feel proud as a health professional. They also saw the need for advocacy to make sure that political, economic, social, cultural, environmental, behavioral, and biological factors support health. I mean, can you see from Lemkin's cultural techniques of genocide, the WHO is seeing what needs to be done, which is the opposite to what the techniques of genocide were. And they realize that these factors need to be mediated, yes, through healthcare, but not the healthcare sector on its own, but also governments, civic societies, industry, and the media. 1986. And then in 2011, 25 years later, someone called Denise Raphael, I know, Raphael again, but in this case, Raphael is a surname. From Canada, he does a discourse analysis on health promotion. Because nothing has shifted in the proper direction, even after that very progressive moment in 1986. And he does this discourse analysis to understand why there's been such failure. So we're going to discuss the discourses that Denise Raphael identifies. Desiree, thank you. And we'll go through all of them. Again, another coincidence. There are 8. He started off with 7, and then he adds an 8th discourse when he worked with someone called Toba Bryant. Okay, it's showing, yeah, with the light off, you'll see. Can you see? Oh, thank you, thank you. I was worried that maybe it's too. Let me turn it around. Sure. So the first discourse, so on the left we have the discourse and on the right we have practical implications. So the first discourse is about identifying those in need of health and social services. And you can see the implications there are that the focus is limited to service provision with assumptions that this will improve health. We're talking during lunch, Ahmed, about difficulties in accessing health services, yeah? So it makes sense, right? Of course, we should do this. But it's got its limitations. And this is what becomes clearer as we look at other discourses. The second discourse is around identifying those with modifiable medical and behavioral risk factors. And there, the focus is on health behaviors with the assumption that targeting lifestyle changes will improve health. Are you beginning to see an issue here? What could be problematic about the second discourse?
The individual is responsible for their health concerns, maintenance, and rehabilitation.
Absolutely. And we start victim blaming here, right? I worked in the US for 2 years as a clinician, 96 to 97. I worked in Tampa first, Tampa, Florida, for about 3 months in a hospital, Tampa Transitional Hospital. It was the first time in my life. It was my first year in the US, and it was the first time in my life that I saw people struggling with morbid obesity. I've not seen that phenomenon anywhere else in the world. At Tampa Transitional Hospital, we received the first person who reached out crying for help. And this became big news, because here again, we in health were going to rescue people like this individual. It was televised. The individual could not fit through a hospital door. He had to be hoisted through the roof. Yes. And after intervention for a couple of weeks, of course, this was a success, right? So they put him on a mayo diet, and they did stomach stapling, and they showed the before and after. Of course, it's a success. Then we had a beeline of individuals coming to the hospital, and one of them who became my patient was a beautiful, beautiful Greek woman, absolutely stunning. And her story around how this came about was sobering. Says, I'm Greek. We love to eat, we love to cook. I don't know how I got here, though. And something is going on in the US. It's been going on for a long time. Only when I came back to South Africa, I realized that the trend is going to South Africa and elsewhere. And I remember saying to my colleagues, because I had entered academia at the time, who were dietitian and nutritionists, can you please intervene? We have a problem. They didn't see they didn't know what I was talking about. And I said, we are headed towards trouble. And it took years even for me to realize what the issues were. I remember that when I was in the US, I couldn't eat the bread. And I couldn't figure out why. But then with time, I've realized what the issue is. Gluten and what they've done to it. GMO'd gluten and what it does to the body. I mean, if they want you to eat more and more of the things that they're advertising, they have to get you addicted. So something is going on, so let's move to the next one. Number 3, left to scroll, right, okay, there. So discourse number 3 is about indicating the material living conditions that shape health. It's a useful discourse because it helps us identify processes by which adverse living conditions come to determine health. So pathways and processes help us identify concepts to work with and the evidence base that should be developed. Are you familiar with the concept of the first 1,000 years, 1,000 days, the first 1,000 days? And a lot of focus and a lot of money to make sure that infants in the first 1,000 days are not subjected to living conditions that will lead to certain kinds of illnesses, including stunting. And there's a lot of focus on that. It's useful to a point. Then 4 is about indicating material living circumstances that differ as a function of group membership. Again, can be useful to carry out identity-based, like gender, class, race analysis of different living conditions and their health-related effects. So here we can begin to point to systemic issues. Next is 5. Oh, why am I there? Why is it not moving? Oh yeah. 5 is about public policy decisions that are made by government and other institutions. And here the attention is directed at government policy making as the source of social and health inequalities and the role of politics. Can be very powerful. I don't know whether you know, especially those from the UK, of a project called Deaths by Welfare. You familiar with that? Deaths by Welfare. Welfare. Someone called China Mills does this work. Yeah, state welfare and benefits. Deaths by welfare is the work. How does she stumble on this? She picks up that there's a spike of suicides involving people with disabilities who are on welfare. And she tracks the stats retrospectively, and she identifies a date where this phenomenon started. And the policy is where if you have a disability, you have to regularly prove your disability and your level of income to continue receiving state welfare. You can imagine what happens to the body, right? Individuals with disabilities who have to subject themselves again and again to assessments by health professions in order to continue receiving welfare. So many refusing the idea of subjecting themselves to this dehumanization choose a different route. They take themselves out of the system. When she flags what's happening here, what does the State Department do? Can you guess? They make the data disappear. They no longer report through their own channels what's happening to these individuals. She was an academic at the time. She leaves the academy at that point. But she continues with the work. And how is it that she continues to track this? Through obituaries in newspapers. But it becomes very clear there, right? What is possible when we look at policy changes and what follows. Now we're going to more interesting discourses which point at structural issues beyond policy. So discourse number 6, Social determinants of health and their distribution result from economic and political structures and justifying ideologies. You can see, right, that we're beginning to talk here. So the focus then becomes the structures that need to be modified that are political and economic. The seventh discourse, social determinants of health and their distribution result from the power and influence of those who create and benefit from health and social inequalities. Now it's getting really interesting. And of course, what we do there is we identify the classes and interests of those who benefit from social and health inequalities and mobilize efforts towards change. Ruthie spoke of philanthropists and gave a very interesting definition. Can you identify individuals who may personify the classes and the interests we're talking about here? Yeah. Bill Gates came first. He has just declared that he, through his foundation that South Africa doesn't have to worry about the withdrawal of NIH funding because it's coming. And South Africans, if they were allowed the platform to say what they will say, that no, we don't want your money. Keep it, because they know. Don't want to say too much on that level. But you know the story of the food pyramid? What happened with the food pyramid? Nutritionists and advising government, what did they say should be at the bottom? We need to eat a lot of. So before that, before they flipped what was there, and then they flipped it. It was protein and grains at the top. But those who farm grains lobbied them, nutritionists. And they changed their advice. And voila, breakfast cereal becomes something we cannot do without. For a long time, my university and Coca-Cola were joined to the hip until it became very clear that we were participating in genocide. And we had one academic who spoke out. They dealt with him, but they couldn't win because the evidence was just too obvious. And with that pushing back, we were able to push back against tobacco, big tobacco. And we also pushed back against those who produce baby formula. I mean, they were hectic, those ones. Funding conferences attended by pediatricians with the understanding that pediatricians will be giving advice on what to feed babies. Dennis Raphael adds this eighth discourse after, like I said, he brought Toba Bryant on board, and this is recent. And they say social determinants of health and their distribution result from the processes inherent to capitalism, capital accumulation, competition, and exploitation. Yeah, again, you're hearing Ruthie again, right? Making money more. And we know who these people are, where greed is what they are interested in. not any of our health. Can you locate yourselves or your country in relation to the discourses that apply in practice? Are you at 8? Are you becoming a post-capitalist socialist state? Where is it happening? Maybe nowhere. But if we're talking decolonial health, decolonizing health sciences and health professions, if we're serious, that's what we will be talking about. You can't do this without a political project. Noam, see that? I mean, Cuba, Venezuela, very interesting. And while in exile, some of our struggle stalwarts were trained in medicine and came with a clear plan on how to keep people healthy and well. But many have not been allowed to practice that kind of medicine. Oh yeah, time moves very fast. Let's move to the next, I think we can put this away and move to the, have you picked up that we were talking about Proposition 4? Did you pick that up? We were talking about chronic population ill health, unmanageable by design, because there are interests, there are classes that benefit from creating and maintaining chronic ill health. They're not interested in us being healthy. It serves them, and it serves them very well. Someone put it beautifully and saying illness is profit. And we are made to participate in that. Let's move quickly to the last proposition, which is diagnosis and treatment as colonial tools for genocide. Again, in the last session, we spoke about death, right? And also how when we want to excavate and find the truth, we have to track how death comes about. When I shared the story of some of the work we started doing around student suicidality, it becomes very clear. Those case studies of those students who died by suicide helped us figure out what was going on. But they would have tried to block us, but they failed. But there are 4 key drivers through which diagnosis and treatment become colonial tools for genocide, and I'll move as fast as I can here. First one is conceptualizing health. How you conceptualize health matters. If you take a salutogenic approach, salutogenic, you'd be interested in how health comes about and how it's maintained. That's what salutogenesis means. How do we attain health and sustain it? Otherwise, we would be talking about pathogenesis, a focus on symptoms and not worrying about the cause. And much of what happens in medicine is this. Medical professions, health professions are obsessed with disease, not health. The second driver that I want to talk about is around pathologizing difference. You're nodding, you can see it, right? Cultural differences may lead some to diagnosis they didn't think they have. And that speaks to that second article that you received, Decolonizing Stigma and Diagnosis. One of the authors, Refilwe Lepere, who I co-authored the article with, is a very gifted individual. So she's a drama therapist, and she studied drama therapy overseas. And the nature of the training meant that she didn't get to engage with patients. The first patients she gets to work with is when she's back in South Africa, and she's given a group to work with individuals who hear voices. What's their diagnosis? Schizophrenia. But Refilwe hears voices too. And after a series of workshops, the group begins to understand that voices that we hear are not the same. Some are soothing voices, while others are not. So the work becomes mediating voices until they sound calmer. Another way of pathologizing difference that I want to use as an example is around language. Which health profession do you think gets deployed to do the work of pathologizing difference? With language being the center, speech therapists. Taught in English, you speak a different language at home, you need therapy. I won't elaborate too much. The last one is ignoring primary causes. Looking the other way. So again, going back to the social determinants of health, you can see that all 8 of them are at least saying something else, not the person. The behavioral, the lifestyle one, the one that focuses on modifiable behavior. There you can see there's an issue, but you can still look at what is behind certain lifestyles. Did we really just become a sedentary people? Out of our choice, we just decided we like to sit. No. This is not the last one, ignoring primary causes. There's the one that's a banger. The power to diagnose. You can see that, right? Plays a key role in driving genocide through healthcare. Necropolitics, where the state becomes the entity that decides on who lives and who dies, and again, professions being co-opted to do the work of necropower. In the example, occupational therapists using assessment tools to determine whether people with disabilities are productive or not. And when they're not deemed productive, then they can go to the gas chambers. So it's not only medical doctors, it's many of us that become the way in which treatment and diagnosis serve as colonial tools for genocide. But we are at a point where you can even be told you are sick without symptoms. Yes. Asymptomatic illness. You look very intrigued by that. You can't think of one example where you told you're sick, you just don't know it. No? The PCR test during COVID? I mean, any of you who went for a test and the test said you were ill, but you didn't know that you were ill? Yeah. And the developer of the PCR test had said it's not for diagnosis, at least not on its own. There needs to be a clinical picture which the patient participates in telling you as a physician, this is what's going on. But that's what was used. Yeah. Yes. Yes. Yeah, you're grieving. But grief has become an illness. Yeah, and you pushed aside. I mean, the COVID one was so interesting because there were other tests that were so powerful and could save lives. When my brother, who lives far from me, got seriously ill with COVID, I had to intervene. I was not there, he was with my nephew, and I had to say to him, go to this doctor, nobody else, and make sure that they use tests to pick up your oxygen saturation level and also the rate of blood clotting. The PCR, what does it do? It looks for virus material. And if you have the virus material up to a certain threshold, you're sick. And there's a difference between certain disciplines, virology versus immunology. You know the difference? Immunologists focus on how the host can coexist with a pathogen. We all are carrying pathogens. Some will tell you it's the exact percentage that is lacking all over our bodies. But they say balance. You tip the balance, then you fall ill. Yes, Una?
So a couple of points, one that came up before and I want to come back to it, and just quickly.
Yeah.
My sense is that the reason that the PCR was so relied upon is because the concern was less with treating the COVID patient and more with the possibility of spreading. And I'm actually thinking of a time when I got a PCR test.
Yeah.
And it came up positive, I had no symptoms, and I was like, it's telling me I'm sick, I don't feel sick. And before I developed symptoms, my mother got COVID because we were in the same room for a couple of days. And so the test was actually correct in the sense that I was sick enough to make her sick, and we both got sick, but it showed up before. So, but I do think, to your point about the clinical diagnosis, the absence of that is that the big concern is about transmission, as opposed to your experience with people with long COVID get during the treatment. But what I really wanted to ask you is actually some reports that have come out over the last 10 years that outcomes for schizophrenia are markedly better in countries where social development is less robust, I guess. We're basically post-colonial countries that have been financially gutted by the colonial system, but where it's presumed that social ties are stronger than in the capitalist Western world. And the outcomes for schizophrenia, for example, in India, have been shown to be somewhat better. I was curious to know what your thoughts were about that. I don't know all of this, I'm reporting on this, but I've heard it a few different cases.
I would like to read the work. I mean, if you stumble upon it. Yeah. I mean, I can imagine that could be the case. But exactly, that's what I was saying. So the PCR alone was not enough. Say you're sick. And on spreading, it depends what it is that you're spreading, because we benefited from spreading in some parts of the world. Yes. So during lockdown, the middle class could lock down. Those who live in townships and were told to socially distance. How do you socially distance in a shack? You don't even have a yard. So what we witnessed was that during the first wave, yes, there were casualties. A colleague and friend of mine, our friend whom we hike with, he's the head of pulmonology in one of the biggest townships in the Western Cape. He's got the data. First wave, yes, casualties. Second wave, very little. Third wave, nothing. And those who succumbed had chronic diseases, had chronic illness. And my brother, who was unwell, had a severe case of COVID. The treatment was there and very effective. My own husband was down with COVID. He got to stay in bed for several days. Gave him ivermectin, worked like a charm. But there's a lot that we are still going to unpack about the COVID moment, and scientists will tell us more, the ones that have remained in that space. I'm going to finish off with one focus in medicine that is very common. I mean, all of us have had, I'm sure we have all had that instrument used to check if we're okay. What do you think I'm talking about? You go to visit a doctor or you see a nurse, and it's one of the things that they will assess. Blood pressure monitor. So, do you know what blood pressure reading will require that you get treatment? Diastolic,
More than
systolic? More than
what they say, but then these have been reduced. The earlier readings were somewhere around 140/90, and now they have come down to 120 and
brilliant.
120/80. Because I'm a hypertensive patient myself.
Yes. So in 1977, you got treated for hypertension if your reading was 160/90. In 1993, it changed to 140/90. And in 2017, especially if you were 65 years or older, 130/80. So it keeps dropping.
Yeah. The ideal, this still says 110/70. This is the ideal one, like maintain that level, 110/70.
Yeah. So I have to measure my blood pressure every day by doctor's order, because I almost died in 2023. I ended up in ICU. I had never been sick. I started working in 1993. Never taken a single day of sick leave. And then I end up in ICU. And after that, I come back home and I noticed that I'm also drinking more wine than usual. I'm finishing almost a bottle a day. And I say to my husband, I need to see someone. And I see the first psychiatrist. I tell my story. And they listen, and they're like, yeah, it's not depression, not anxiety either. I can see how we got here, but I'll put you on antidepressants anyway. So I'm like, bye-bye. And I go to a second psychiatrist, beautiful black woman who listens to my story, and she says, not you. It's not you. Not you. My high blood pressure moment follows an event where I'm humiliated in public, where Parliament visited us at the university after we had been summoned on issues of governance, and parliamentarians are not satisfied, and there's some who were students at my university, so they know me, and they noticed that I didn't say anything when we visited Parliament. So I get tipped off that they won't be satisfied if they don't hear you speak. Because, you know, my colleagues, male and of lighter complexion, and parliamentarians are mostly my complexion. So I was ready, except that the chair of council said to me, Elelwani, since you are mentioned in that panel report that investigated governance issues, maybe you are conflicted, maybe you shouldn't attend. So I said, well, it's Parliament, and I believe there are legal resources within Parliament to advise on whether I'm the only one that's conflicted here. Since the report I read, council is also implicated. I mean, governance is a big thing. It's a big thing. I can't be the only person conflicted here. So he said, oh, no, you're right. And then I go to this space which is televised. When Parliament summons you or when they visit you, you're speaking to the nation. I knew to ask for immunity. Yeah, you get immunity if you go to Parliament. And once I was assured, I knew. When that question was asked, how's the university doing on transformation? It's my portfolio. I had to respond. So I responded pointing at data, including dismissals. Who gets dismissed? It's racialized. So we have a long way to go. That's what I say. But then my boss and the chair of council say, we don't know what she's talking about. They get chastised, but the damage was done. And others are saying, you're so brave. And the following day, I end up in ICU. So my psychiatrist says, it's not you. And she sends me away to a place where I spend time reflecting on resources to help me struggle as I go. Diagnosis and treatment can be colonial tools for genocide. Thank you.